The
current water crisis is the result of decades of overexploitation. Between 1960 and 2000, the worldwide overuse of groundwater has more than doubled. A current study by water corporations and by the World Bank concludes that by 2030, global water demand will outstrip supply by about 40%. Many rivers, the most important renewable water reserves for people, are through melting glaciers, pumped empty groundwater reserves, and pollution on the brink of collapse. According to the magazine Nature, nearly 80% of the world's population lives next to rivers whose water supply is highly threatened. In Marseille, we spoke with the renowned water activist Maude Barlow. Barlow is chairperson of the largest Canadian civil rights organization, the Council of Canadians, and founder of the Blue Planet Project. In 2005, she received the Alternative Nobel Prize, and between 2008-2009, she was advisor to the President of the UN General Assembly on water issues. She is author and co-author of 16 books, including the international bestseller Blue Covenant, The Global Water Crisis and the Coming Battle for the Right to Water.
Welcome to Kontext TV, Maude Barlow. Especially in recent years, we have seen water shortages, droughts, and drying up of lakes all over the world, in Asia, Africa, Latin America, US, and also in Southern Europe. Is the planet drying out?
The world is running out of clean water. We were all taught as children that that couldn't happen. We were taught, which is true, that there's a specific exact amount of water in the hydrologic cycle. It's small in comparison to all the water in the world, but we were taught can't go anywhere. It goes around and around in the hydrologic cycle, and you can do whatever you want to it. Our teachers weren't lying, but it was not true. We're either polluting it, or we're pumping our rivers to death and pumping groundwater at a rate that we didn't have the technology to do 30, 40 years ago. And we're either growing food for the global food trade and therefore shipping that water away in what's called virtual water trade, or we're taking that land-based water and we're sending it into mega cities, and when they're finished with it, they're dumping it in the ocean. There's a recent study that said that at least a quarter of the reason for the rising oceans is not climate change as we've understood it. It's the actual displacement of land-based water into the ocean through cities, through industry, through industrial agriculture. So this is really important for people to understand. Yes, that water is still on the planet somewhere, but it's either polluted in the oceans or embedded in food and other commodities that we can't get at anymore. We are a planet that talks about drought. It's not cyclical drought. It's a crisis. We've got the demand going straight up and the supply going straight down. It's called exponential extraction. Just quickly give you an image that I use, and that is there's a big bathtub and it's got a whole lot of water in it, and a whole bunch of people have straws and blindfolds, and they're drinking the water, drinking it and drinking it, and there's lots of water for everybody until the moment there's no water for anybody. That's the groundwater story, and we haven't come to terms with it. We were raised with this myth of abundance, this myth that it could never run out, and if we don't turn our heads around quite quickly around this, we are going to see terrible, terrible suffering in the future.
Maude Barlow, you already touched the issue. In your books, you talk a lot about the exploitation of groundwater and aquifers. First, explain what these aquifers are and why it is so detrimental and dangerous to tap them.
Aquifers are groundwater sources. They're pools of water under the ground. Sometimes they're closed, sometimes they're open, sometimes they're part of underground rivers. We have not properly mapped them around the world, so we're not quite sure what their sustainability is, but we do know in some cases that we are pulling that water up in totally unsustainable ways. A recent study on groundwater around the world found that we're doubling groundwater extraction every 20 years, and that we are literally physically coming to the bottom of the water table in many parts of the world because we're pulling that water up faster than it can be replenished. I mean, if you allow it to be replenished, which it can usually get, then that's okay. But if you don't allow that replenishment, it's my bathtub image. You've taken the water, it's gone, it won't come back. And what we also need to understand is that we're using bore well technology we didn't have a number of years ago. There are bore wells that go down into the ground, as far into the ground as skyscrapers go into the sky, and they suck that water. The Ogallala Aquifer in the United States used to be the biggest aquifer in the world, no more. It's down to about half the food production it had in the 1980s. They have 200,000 bore wells going 24/7, pumping that water. The famous Aral Sea, which wasn't groundwater, was surface water, but it was a lake in the former Soviet Union. It was so big they called it a sea, an inland sea. They pumped it for cotton production in the desert. It's gone. Lake Chad in Africa is gone. I mean, we can actually destroy massive bodies of water if we relentlessly pump them. And we have got to learn this, because we keep repeating this. Even people in the area of development and human rights keep talking about building more pipes into the ground. That's not the answer, or maybe the answer partially some places, but the answer is to protect source water and stop that over-extraction of these water sources.
We've talked already about virtual water. An average European consumes about 30 times more water through imported goods than through tapped water. Explain what virtual water is and what the significance is.
Virtual water is the most important concept for us to try to understand. Virtual water is the water embedded in everything that we have, all the food that we eat, how much water it took to produce the food. If a family of 4 sits down with a small steak each, they're drinking the equivalent or consuming the equivalent of an Olympic-sized swimming pool. We have to get that into our heads. We don't count virtual water when we ask how much water people use every day. We're talking about their use in the home. So for instance, for years now, about at least a decade, the United Nations and all the scientists have been saying that we consume 400 liters per person per day. Now, of course, half the world doesn't consume anything like that, so the other half, or the top third, is consuming more. But a recent study adding virtual water, that's all the water that for all the goods and services, for energy, for food, for computers and everything, it's tenfold. The average per capita consumption of water per day is 4,000 liters. And again, remembering that at least half of the population of the world isn't in the consumer market at all, so they're not included in that. We are massively over-pumping water for our lifestyle. And it's why I make a deep connection with free trade and unregulated trade and growth, because the notion is, well, let's just keep growing. Let's just more stuff, more trade agreements to give corporations more rights, fewer protections for governments or ability for governments to protect local resources and so on. It's devastating, because it's pumping up water in watersheds that go into say a food product that's shipped off out of not only the watershed but out of the country. I mean, people often say to me, well, name a place in the world that's taking care of its water pretty well. And I often say, at first glance, Europe is probably better than anywhere, in the sense that Europe has recognized water shortages and has agreed upon and assigned a watershed management project in 2000 where if countries share a watershed, they have to share responsibility and care for it. However, part of the reason Europe is able to do that is it's rich enough to import virtual water, from food to flowers to computers to everything else, from countries where they're going to use their scarce water sources to provide that water. In fact, England, Great Britain, imports 2/3 of its footprint in virtual water imports. So it's very important for us to stop thinking of water as your water use is just what you use on a daily basis. And it's interesting, there's an analyst, an investment analyst, who said, and it's true, we've got to stop thinking that the water wars of the future will be on a battlefield somewhere. They're going to be on the grain markets, of the stock markets and the grain trading, of the international trading system. It is about the water that has been pulled into this profit-making, mostly food production, and it's very dangerous.
What role does global warming play regarding the global water crisis?
It's really interesting. We all know that global warming from fossil fuels, over use of fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions is affecting water because it's warming water. Of course, as the air warms, the water warms. We have much less ice cover on our lakes. We have glaciers melting everywhere in the world. Every single glacier in the world is slated for full melt, probably within this century. So we know it's impacting water. What is less understood is that the way we're treating water is impacting climate. And by that I mean when you displace water from a watershed, you remove the ability of the hydrologic cycle to produce in its normal way. Because what happens is, as a scientist friend of mine uses to show people, he takes a slide, he says that's the sun, and then he takes a blue slide and he puts it over it, and he says the blue of the water and the yellow of the sun make the green of vegetation. If you take the blue away, the rain hit, it's dry soil, they can't grow anything, and so the rains move away. If you cut down a rainforest, the rain leaves. It's part of the cycle, and if we maintain and restore watersheds, we help the hydrologic cycle to be maintained, and that helps temper the climate. That's a tempering influence on climate. So what I'm working with some scientists who believe that our abuse of water is at least as great a cause of climate change as greenhouse gas emissions. And I think it's the missing piece in our analysis.
How is the global water crisis harming people all over the world, especially the poor? Who's got the short end of the stick? And what does it mean for people if we continue with our high water consumption?
Well, of course, as the global demand grows up and the global supply goes down for something you need for life, it's not surprising that it's becoming very expensive. And it's not surprising that big private companies are in here grabbing at it. And so now we have a situation where we have people unable to pay, having to do without. Now, we tend to think of the problem as being in the global south, and it mostly is, or the worst crisis is. And a new report from the World Health Organization says that every 3.5 seconds a child dies in the global south of waterborne disease. What people need to understand is that this is also beginning to happen in the global north, particularly, of all places, the United States. For instance, in Detroit, Michigan, they've cut the water services off to about 90,000 families because they can't afford water. The water rates went up, they cut their water. They're living in third world conditions. They're having to leave their area and go begging for water, go try to find water fountains and or hoses and fill up their water cans. You know, I mean, it's just, as we move to a world more and more divided by rich and poor, with a shrinking middle class everywhere, and as we move to a world where there's less water and more privatized and more held in corporate hands, we're going to see more and more and more people denied water, and that is why it is so important to assert that water is a human right and a public commons and a public trust.